As I think about the last 2 years or so, we know ever since 2020 with the COVID pandemic and all, a lot has been said about it. There's still people taking precautions, which precautions are not a bad thing at all. I honestly am not sure if we are still considered technically in a pandemic or not. All I know is I don't hear as much about it on the news, maybe because of things that have come up in the meantime. War over in Europe, gas prices as high as they've been. It seems like they sort of gravitate towards the story of the day and sort of kick the other stories to the side. So I don't know what is this the new normal that we're dealing with? I know that I just talked to a dentist office the other day. They confirmed an appointment. They said, when you come in, please still wear a mask. Okay, so you got to know who wants you to do that, who doesn't do that. There's so much we could say about it, and I don't want to really get into the weeds too much. But I try to keep up on current events and so forth. And with a year or more of data at our disposal since 2020 and the shutdowns and all the people who've been hospitalized, and there's so many numbers you could really just choke a horse with, that I don't want to get into a lot of that stuff. I recently looked at a publication called The Federalist. Maybe you've seen this. I access it online. And there was a very interesting story that was written. And in this story, they analyzed a recent study published by a nonprofit organization called Mental Health America. And again, without bothering you with a bunch of numbers that are hard to follow when someone is speaking, the gist of it is that they have determined year over year since 2020, there are more Americans suffering from mental illness now than there were in 2019. And obviously, they are attributing a lot of this to the shutdowns and just a change, and you couldn't get away from news about COVID on the TV and just everything together. When they talk about mental illness, they're talking about anxiety, depression, and more serious things than that. They're saying there's been an increase in drug usage, and overdoses were on the rise in 2020. And a lot of it's because the world has just been turned upside down, and that's just how some people have chosen to deal with things. And from my perspective, the shame is that the youth weren't even immune to mental health issues. This one article talked about an increase in severe major depression among those aged 11 to 17. They say that as many as 10% of that age group suffer from some kind of major depression now. And so mental health experts suggest, again, that maybe in certain circumstances it may have been better to just keep them in school in 2020 rather than pull them out and do the online learning. It is such a difficult situation, and it's easy to say in hindsight what we should have or shouldn't do. So keep that in mind as well. But there are some studies that say that children in that age group were they had a much easier time recovering from COVID if they did get it. And again, it's easy to say after the fact, because in reality, many of those in that age group live with maybe grandparents or great-grandparents. So what do? Keep them in school, let them contract it, take it home, and then give it to their grandparents who might not have such an easy time getting over it. So it's not that easy. We can't simply say we never should have or shouldn't have. So just a very complicated issue. The fact is that what I want to share with you here is just a summary, couple sentences, maybe a paragraph from this article, that they just talk about this entire generation of children faces the consequences, and we don't know what's going to come of this, more or less a lost year of development, they call it. not being around their peers and so forth, not having extracurricular activities, and sadly, they even talk about a surge in student suicides. There was one school in Nevada that ended up reopening relatively early compared to the others after just a couple months of closure, saying that they needed to reckon with their mental health crisis more so than any risk associated with contracting COVID. So, of course, it's not just young, it's not just the old, everybody has been dealing with this, and some people just are living every day thinking that there's no end in sight. And it's that idea that it seems like no end is in sight, things keep piling on, that brings us to Job. And last week we looked at chapter 1, we saw what he was dealing with, lost all 10 of his children on one day in a tragic accident, lost more than that actually, a lot of his livestock, which was his livelihood. And it seems like as we move to chapter 2, it goes from bad to worse for him. It seems like he was kicked really hard in chapter 1, and in chapter 2 we see then he gets kicked while he's down again. Even more happens. And so that is the introduction to chapter 2, which we'll look at now. If you're following in your Pew Bible, you'll find it on page 360. And we're just reading the first 10 verses of Job chapter 2. It says, "On another day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, 'Where have you come from?' Satan answered the Lord, 'From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it.' Then the Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason.' 'Skin for skin,' Satan replied. 'A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face.' The Lord said to Satan, 'Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life.' So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, 'Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die.' He replied, 'You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?' In all this, Job did not sin in what he said." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of his holy word. So as I mentioned before we read that, last week we looked at chapter 1 and we saw the events that killed all 10 of Job's children. But Job doesn't crack yet. God tells Satan that Job is holding firm to his faith. God says, "Satan, he's a good guy, no matter what you do to him." And then Satan goes and says one thing. He says it's one thing to strike Job's children, but let's up the ante a bit here. If you strike Job, Satan says it's going to be a different story. And let's understand exactly what Satan is alleging here. He is saying that Job loves himself more than his children. And we consider Job an Old Testament Christian. So what kind of a Christian would love themselves and put themselves before their children? That's what Satan is saying here. And I would say, I can only speak for my own family. I know that if you'd ask Tracy or myself, we would both say if we had the choice that either one of our children would be diseased or struck with an affliction, or us, if we had that choice, 100 out of 100 times we'd pick ourselves, of course. And Job, I know, is the same way. Yet Satan asserts that Job is just a very selfish man. And God knows better too. That's why God says, okay, I'll let you test him, and he's going to prove this out. And there's so many details about Job's condition. We only see a little bit of it here in Job 2, but when you read the whole book, much later on, you see just the disgusting images of what this man was reduced to. And again, they're just trying to put this picture together in your mind. For instance, we know that in chapter 2, he gets these painful boils from his head to his foot. And I've tried to research what some people have sort of drawn images of what Job might have looked like. I've seen a lot of them, and honestly, so far I haven't really found what I consider a biblically accurate portrayal. They do their best, they're trying, but when you actually open the Bible and see the details there, I have yet to see a picture of Job that includes all of it. If you do this when you go home, if you get on your computer or phone or whatever, if you Google biblical Job, pictures of something like that, you'll probably see a man with a few chicken pox here and there, something that looks like that. A very sad face, of course. It was so much worse than that. Again, painful boils, you can't really draw the pain, but still the Bible says, and again, these are very gruesome images, pus-filled, covering his entire body. So bad that in order to get just a little bit of relief, he took a piece of broken pottery and scraped his skin. And another thing is you might think, well, it would be bad to deal with this for a couple days or a week, something like that. But the Bible tells us later on that this lasted a very long time. Later on anyway, it says, Job says, so I have been allotted months of futility. So we know that it lasted at least that long. And in chapter 2, you basically get the sense that he was in an unrecognizable condition with everything that his body was dealing with. I'm sure we've all seen people with cancer going through chemo and radiation and what that does to your body. And that's a terrible thing. Your hair falls out and some people look just very frail. How long can the chemo treatments last, though? This is something that is continual, day after day for months after month. There's another example later in the book. If you would go read as far as chapter 30, I don't see this in many of the paintings either that I see of Job. He says, "My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever." So just again, imagine months of dealing with this condition. Feels like his skin is falling off and he aches to his bones. And then he goes on to say, "And wearisome nights have been appointed to me. When I lie down, I say, when shall I rise and the night be ended?" So he can't sleep at all in this condition. "For I have had my fill of tossing till dawn." Maybe we've dealt with that a night or two, but have you dealt with that night after night for months on end? And we know that when you can't get the right amount of sleep, it takes a toll on just your entire well-being. Sleep is that important for your physical health and mental health, and so Job just had no rest for all these months. And then, like I said, it's not just physical, but also mental health too. So how do you imagine that affects his mind? It's not an exaggeration that I would see. I look at this and I can actually see how a person would look forward to death after dealing with something like this for so long. And so the agony compounds itself. Job has plenty of time to think during these months too. He just doesn't, sit there and wait, I'm sure. I can imagine what he's thinking. Why is this happening to me? Did God do this to me? Did I do something to deserve this? Questions that we have whenever we're dealing with difficult situations too. And again, some more gruesome details. Job even says at one point, my flesh is caked with worms and dust. My skin is cracked and breaks out afresh. That's not the end of his condition either. Terrible breath, too, he talks about later in his book. And this is something that when I got to thinking of this, I don't know if this was any of your situations in your lives, but it seems to me newlywed couples, they're all in love with each other and everything's new and you get to live together now and create your family and all that. And I don't know if you've ever kissed anyone in the morning before they brush their teeth. I've done that a couple times, and then we sort of said, okay, let's not do this. So, morning breath is a thing, and it can really kill a mood. But Job's was not just morning breath, though. He actually says in his book in chapter 19, my breath is offensive to my wife. So not only, and the thing is, Job only has his wife for comfort here too, and she can't really even stand to be around him either. Certainly you need your spouse with you to give you comfort in your darkest time, and this is darker time than anybody probably has ever experienced. For Job, nothing just seems to go right. Even his own wife piles on, and she's basically saying, putting in my own words, just look at yourself, Job. You are just a shell of what you used to be. Is this any way to go on living? And you're still trying to hold on to your integrity. Nobody can stand to be around you, if she'd be completely honest. And that's when she says, just die, curse God before you do it, because God is the reason that you are in this predicament. Job's wife, we don't know her name, so I'll call her Mrs. Job, or Job's wife, whatever. She gets a lot of flack for her few words, about a dozen words, I think, in the NIV here. And a lot of it's deserved, too, by the way. It's just something, it's really hard to defend somebody suggesting someone else curse God and die. Because there's, of course, no circumstance where it would be appropriate to do that. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. But I do think we need to look at the situation and see where she's coming from. The book, when we look at the book, we tend to focus on Job and what he's dealing with. But again, he has a wife. She's dealing with this along with him. We say Job lost 10 children. She lost 10 children as well. She was pregnant, assuming they weren't twins, pregnant for 9 months, 10 times over. She was pregnant a lot. And again, as a man, I can never I can never feel that bond that a mother has with her children from being pregnant. It must be the most amazing thing. I've heard women say it's just the greatest thing ever to know that you're holding a baby inside you and giving birth and all that. And she got to do it 10 times, and on one day that was all taken away from her. So I can see where she would be bitter. I certainly can understand that. So modern studies confirm some ideas we might think are pretty self-explanatory about grieving the loss of a child. Parents are more likely to, and for lack of better words, I don't know the best way to put it, bounce back maybe after passing of a child. If first of all, if you have other children. So, okay, I lost one, but I still have 1 or 2 or 3 more. That helps. Mrs. Job didn't have that. All 10 gone same day. They say that it also helps if a parent had the opportunity to say goodbye. Again, Mrs. Job didn't have that. She went, I don't know if she went home or whatever, she just got the news, all 10 of your kids gone, they died, house fell on them. So that was terrible as well. The only thing that I see that really plays in her favor is that they still tell us that those who have a religious leaning tend to bounce back better than those who don't have that kind of hope. And I'm sure that Mrs. Job did have faith. Her faith wasn't very strong on that day, but I don't know whose would be very strong, honestly. But it seems that Job knew, he must have known, this isn't like her to talk like this. And I know that because he says, you speak like a foolish woman. If she always talked like this and said these things, why would he be led to say that? So it seems to me he knows, hey, I know that you're grieving, you're having difficulty, just don't go down that path. And he knows that she's better than that. I'm sure she spoke out with anger. We do things without thinking. It happens. And I also think her response wasn't only a reaction to the loss of her 10 children all in one day, but also to what she sees happening to Job, thinking, I lost my 10 children, and I see my husband here, who probably would be better off dead. At least he wouldn't be hurting so much. And so all of this comes crashing down on this woman, and we get 12 words from her that aren't very flattering in regards to her character. She loved her children, she loved her husband, she married him, she had 10 kids with him, and now he doesn't even look like the man that she married. And so it certainly hurt her to see him in such a condition. And it's a shame, again, she gets such a bad rap because we don't know how the story ends with her. That's the last we hear from her. Spoiler alert, if you haven't read the book in the entirety, she gets 10 more children at the end. Doesn't make up for the 10 that she lost, but God does bless her, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I think it's a bit unfair to judge her based on a dozen foolish words probably said off the cuff without thinking in one day. The question is, do those 12 words represent her entire life? Think of your worst day, times when you just said something that you didn't mean and you didn't think it through and you hurt somebody's feelings maybe. Would you want someone to look at that and say, that's what this person is, and judge you based on it? So I think sometimes we are more likely to read Job 2, read this, think that's all that there is to this woman, and hopefully there wasn't. Again, we don't know, but I'm just urging you to hold judgment, because one day we may get to heaven and see her there and wonder, oh, how did you get here? Because that was just a bad day that we saw in Job chapter 2. And the reality is, she isn't the only person in the Bible who said something that she regretted. Just a couple examples. Peter lied 3 times whenever he said he didn't know Jesus. Does that represent who Peter is? No, I don't think we would say that. And with the story of David, if you remember, after he committed adultery with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan came to him and he tells him this story he made up about a rich man who robbed a poor man, took everything that he had, and David's just so beside himself and upset. And then Nathan says, you are the man that I'm talking about here. So again, David sort of ate his own words there. That's not who David was in the entirety. He was a man after God's own heart, and he still did that. But did you ever notice that our heroes of the faith tend to be really bad people at some time in their lives? I could go through the list, and here's just a few. Noah got drunk. Joseph in the Old Testament, some say he was very arrogant. Jacob stole the birthright. David committed adultery, covered up with murder. Jonah ran the other way when God told him to preach. As I said, Peter denied Jesus. Paul hunted down Saul, who became Paul, hunted down Christians, had them killed, and the list goes on and on. So why are they our heroes if they're bad people? It's because the Bible is a book about redemption. We see that page after page. And if they did repent of their sin, which we suspect many of the ones hearers of the faith did, then we expect to see them one day in heaven too. Again, we don't know, we don't have enough evidence if Mrs. Job repented. If you read to the very end of the book, chapter 42, I think there's some clues in there that suggest that she might have. If I'd have to guess, I'd say yes, she did. But I don't know that for sure. I'm getting ahead of myself, though, because we're only in chapter 2. That's 40 chapters away. But in chapter 2, yes, she allowed her emotions to get the best of her. She said something I'm sure she regretted. But that's what Satan wants from all of us. And he got to Mrs. Job in a weak moment. He wants us to make mistakes that tarnish our faith. And again, we can say, well, you just stand up to Satan. Easier said than done, isn't it? But it's during the bad times that we especially need to do our best to keep the level head and control our emotions and our feelings and so forth. So in James' letter, for instance, he says, therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. So we can take great comfort in those words. He continues to say, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. And so you might wonder, how do you do this? Well, basically, it takes practice, it takes effort, and it comes as we mature in the faith. As James writes, it starts by living a life in submission to God. And as a result, we will be able to resist the devil. And James says if you resist him enough, he will flee. He's going to move on to an easier target because he has limited resources. And we see with Job that he did deal with this physical condition for months, but his condition did not worsen though. Again, you wonder how bad could it get. At least it didn't get any worse, and we see that eventually it did get better. And I think that's because Job didn't give Satan any satisfaction by giving in to what his wife suggested and cursing God. I came across this little snippet, I'll say, from Charles Spurgeon. He had a lot of really insightful things to offer. And he just talks about not giving the enemy any satisfaction whenever he is attacking us. And Spurgeon says there's a story of a man who was going to give $1. And again, Spurgeon's talking, 1800s, so $1 was worth a lot more than now. But a man was going to give $1 to a charitable institution. And the devil said, no, don't do it. You can't afford it. Then the man said, I will give $2 then. And he says, I will not be dictated to in this way. Satan exclaimed, you are a fanatic. And the man says, all right, I'm giving $4. Satan says, what will your wife say when you go home and tell her you've given away $4? Well, the man says, I'm going to give $8 now. And if you do not mind what you are at, you will tempt me to give 16. So the devil was obliged to stop because the more he tempted him, the more he went the other way. So let it be with us. If the devil would drive us to curse God, let us bless him all the more. And Satan will be wise enough to leave off the tempting. When he finds that, the more he attempts to drive us, the more we go in the opposite direction. This is what Job was able to do, but his wife wasn't able to do on that day. Not meaning that he's a super saint and that she's a terrible person. Does this comparison between Job and his wife seem a little familiar though? Again, maybe somebody here is dealing with a difficult situation. The question that we have to answer by our actions is, who will you model? Will you model Job in the moment or his wife in the moment? Will you respond to adversity in a way where you cling to the truth or believe the lie? Because Job said, shall we indeed accept good from God and shall we not accept adversity? So sometimes it might seem easier to follow the advice of Job's wife, throw your integrity out the window and just give up, curse God, curl up and want to die. Every time that we are kicked while we are down is an opportunity to choose. We choose right or wrong. We choose blessing or cursing. We choose forgiving or holding a grudge. We choose honor or dishonor. And so the question is, how do we do this? What can we do? Well, the time now, if things are going well for you, hopefully they are, is cultivate your relationship with God now as much as you can, so that when the bad days come, you are prepared to withstand the attacks of the enemy. And if the bad days haven't come, if the Lord gives you enough days on earth, we know the bad days are going to come eventually. And we know that Job shows us especially, once the enemy starts kicking you, he doesn't just leave it at that. He continues to kick you even when you're down. And he does at every opportunity. So if we can become strong in the faith like Job was, and even strong in the faith doesn't mean that he understood everything or he didn't have questions. That's what a lot of the rest of the book is about. But if we're strong in the faith like he was, we will be prepared to accept good from God as well as adversity. And it's an opportunity to just know that we are walking with God every step of the way, and he is holding our hands even in our darkest times. Let's close with a word of prayer.